Hello students, please print out your lesson 8.5 handout and get started on your 4 warm-up problems. On the next slide you have the 4 warm-up problems without the solutions, and so you can stop on that slide if you needed to copy it because you couldn't print it, and then afterwards you have the solutions to the 4 warm-up problems. On the next slide, you will see the solution to the first 2 problems, and then on the following slide, you will see the solution to problem number 3 and 4. Please recall from your unit circle that the ordered pair x and y is cosine and sine. Also, I would like you to recall that tangent theta is the same as y over x, or in other words, tangent theta is also sine theta over cosine theta. So we can calculate sine theta over cosine theta looking at all our x and y coordinates for each of the ordered pairs when we are going to fill out the table of values for the tangent function. So let's start out just like we started graphing sine and cosine functions, starting with 0 degrees. So we are going to do y over x, which is 0 over 1. So that's going to give us a 0 value. Then we'll go to pi over 6. So pi over 6 is right here. So it's going to be 1/2 divided by the square root 3 over 2. So let's write that to the side. 1/2 divided by the square root 3 over 2, which is the same as 1/2 times 2 over root 3. So if we simplify by 2, we get 1 over root 3. However, we need to rationalize the denominator. So multiply top and bottom by root 3 over root 3. So that's going to give us root 3 over 3. So let's go ahead and write that into our table of values. So it is root 3 over 3. So let's move on to the next ordered pair, which is pi over 4. So pi over 4 is our 45-degree angle here. Root 2 divided by root 2. So that's just going to give us a value of 1. Then we are moving on to pi over 3, 60-degree angle. So this one is root 3 divided by 1/2. So let's write this to the side. We have root 3 over 2 divided by 1/2. Multiply by the reciprocal. So that's root 3 over 2 times 2 over 1, which will give us, after simplifying by 2, will give us the square root of 3. So let's go ahead and write that into our table of values. So now we are going to move on to pi over 2, which is our 90-degree angle. And then we'll have 1 divided by 0. Everyone remembers that we cannot divide by 0. So this is going to be an undefined value, which means that we are going to have a vertical asymptote at pi over 2. So I'm going to right away graph that into my coordinate plane. So then I move on to 2 pi over 3. So 2 pi over 3 is over here. So it's root 3 over 2 divided by negative 1/2. So that is going to give us negative root 3. Then we move to 3 pi over 4, which is right here. So negative root 2 over, or root 2 over 2 divided by negative root 2 over 2. So that's going to give us negative 1. Then we move to 5 pi over 6, 1/2 divided by negative root 3 over 2. So that's going to give us negative root 3 over 3. And then we are going to arrive at pi. So pi, if you look at it again, is going to be 0 divided by negative 1. So the value at pi is going to be 0. Then we move on to 7 pi over 6. So negative half divided by negative root 3 over 2. So that's going to give us root 3 over 3. Then we are going to go to 5 pi over 4, which is negative root 2 over 2 divided by negative root 2 over 2. So that's going to give us 1. Then we move to 4 pi over 3. So negative root 3 over 2 divided by negative half. So that's going to be root 3. Then we move to 3 pi over 2. So 3 pi over 2 is here. So we go to negative 1 divided by 0. So we arrive at another place where the graph is going to be undefined. So I'm going to graph that in my graph right away. That 3 pi over 2, the graph is going to be undefined again. And then I move to 5 pi over 3. So 5 pi over 3 is right here. Negative root 3 over 2 divided by 1/2. So that's going to give me negative root 3. So from here, now we are going to move to the negative direction. So if we go to negative pi over 6, which would be over here, that would be root 3 is actually negative half divided by root 3 over 2. So that's going to give us negative root 3 over 3. And then we move to negative pi over 4, so that's right here. So we are going to have negative root 2 over 2 divided by root 2 over 2, so that's going to give us a negative 1 value. Then we move to negative pi over 3, so we are right here. So negative root 3 over 2 divided by 1/2, so that's going to give us negative root 3. And then we are going to move to negative pi over 2, which is right here. It's the same as 3 pi over 2. So that's going to give us negative 1 divided by 0. So we just found another undefined spot. So we are going to now graph our third asymptote at negative pi over 2. So let's go ahead and find some values on our calculator. We need the square root of 3, which is approximately 1.7. And we also need the square root of 3 divided by 3, which is going to give us approximately 0.6. So now we are going to graph these points in our coordinate plane. I will use a different color to graph the graph. So at negative pi over 3, I have negative root 3. I would say it is going to be my negative pi over 3. So negative root 3 is 1.7. So if 2 is here, 1.7 is about here. Then I go to negative pi over 4, which is negative 1. So then I'm going to put my point over here. Then I go to negative pi over 6. So that's about here. And again, I have about negative 0.6. So I'm going to graph that here. And at 0, I have 0. Then again, pi over 6 is about here. And then I need to graph 0.6. So the point is approximately here. And then at pi over 4, I need to graph 1. So 1 is about right here. And at pi over 3, I need to graph root 3. So that's about 1.7. So I'm going to graph that over here. And now I'm going to connect these points with a nice curve, making sure that I'm not passing anywhere on my asymptotes. And I just got myself the first part of tangent, the tangent graph. So now I'm going to graph a second cycle. So we are going to continue the graph. So we arrived at, after the vertical asymptote at pi over 2, we arrived at 2 pi over 3, where we have a negative root 3, which is about negative 1.7. So that's down here. Then we have negative 1 at 3 pi over 4. Then at 5 pi over 6, we'll have about 0.6. So right here. And at pi, we have 0. Then we have 0.6. We have 1. And again, we have 1.73. So we can complete the second cycle of the graph, of the tangent graph. So this is my y equals tangent x graph. So let us identify the asymptotes. So the asymptote here is x equals 3 pi over 2. The second asymptote is x equals pi over 2. And this last asymptote was x equals negative pi over 2. And I will label these asymptotes. And then we are going to find our zeros or x-intercepts. So our x-intercepts occur at 0, 0. And the second one is at pi 0. The graph is always increasing between the asymptotes. So we have to find the interval where it's increasing. So the increasing interval is between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, and between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. I put the parentheses because negative pi over 2, and 3 pi over 2 are not included. The function is going to be odd because if I substitute pi over 6, I get a positive 0.6. If I substitute negative pi over 6 right here, I get negative 0.6. So that means the function is going to be odd. So if I'm going to look at this graph, it's a little bit different. It is a periodic graph, just like the sine graph and the cosine graph. However, this graph has an asymptote and or multiple asymptotes. And if I'm looking at the period where the graph repeats itself, it's kind of interesting because it repeats itself between asymptotes. So from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, it repeats itself. So it's a negative half and a half pi. And if I add that distance together, I could see that the period of this graph is actually going to be pi rather than being 2 pi, like it was on the sine and the cosine graphs.